Welcome to LookAhead Radio with Tom Arms and Lockwood Phillips.
We're looking forward to the conversation this evening. We have so much on tap. It's going to be difficult to get to it all, but hopefully we will with Tom Arms this evening of LookAheadNews.com and, of course, LookAhead Radio. You're listening to Viewpoints Around the World. And with that, Tom, good evening, and thanks for taking the time to be with us. What's it like in London right now?
It's quite pleasant. We're supposed to be getting some sort of storm. I can't remember the name of it. We're going to be having winds of 70, 75 miles an hour or something like that. A spring storm, but spring is definitely on the way.
And here, too, as well. Very interesting. All right. What does this do for the businesses in, let's just take London. Is there kind of a bump in the business activity as the weather improves?
No, I not particularly. It's pretty much business as usual.
I've got to ask, what about the political fervor in the UK? Does that change with the weather as well?
I don't think so. No, I don't think the weather will have any impact on the political fervor in this country. It's running at fever pitch. And so I don't think it being cold, warm, or anything else is going to have much. You'll probably have more demonstrations out on the streets. People will be out there marching up and down as the weather gets warmer. But they spend a lot of time in the winter doing the same thing.
Interesting. Well, we'll be seeing a lot more, I think, political activities here in the near term. Let's talk about something that bridges the Atlantic, the big pond, as they say. Has to start with Milo Yiannopoulos. And of course, he's a Brit and has created quite a stir. And I'm just wondering, of course, the announcement several days ago in which a piece was lifted, if you will, and he's been accused of supporting and being a positive viewer of pedophilia, which he claims is not the intent of his explanation or his description, but we'll not get into that. More importantly, I'm wondering, what is the news about that in the UK? Because, of course, he is a Brit. So what has been the news there, both in the UK and possibly in other countries, France, Germany, etc.?
Well, here in the UK, they've reported it straight. That he resigned, or was he resign? Did he resign or was he sacked? I can't remember which.
Well, everybody thinks he was. He says he's resigned.
His book deal, and he's more or less been banned from campuses everywhere, and things like that. So it's just been reported absolutely straight. The personality, he's reported as a flamboyant gay figure who is solidly behind Donald Trump and solidly behind the alt-right movement. So it's just pretty straight reporting of the facts.
This is interesting related to the alt-right movement. He strongly disassociates himself with the extreme members of either side of either party, the extreme right or the extreme left, and has said so publicly on numerous occasions. Yet there's this continued effort to connect him with various organizations, Nazis, etc., and which you find, if you think about it, very humorous in light of the fact that that group of people do not like homosexuals, and he is blatantly homosexual. There's no question about
outrageously
it.
So. Very camp.
Very, very, very provocateur, as everybody's been describing him. So with that said, does he have much interest? Is there much interest in him in Europe anyhow?
No, I don't think so. There's interest in Breitbart News, but I don't think there's so much interest in him. He hasn't been really reported in great detail until the last few days.
Interesting. All right. Let's move on to other items here. Let's stay with Britain here for a few moments. I want to get to Sweden a little later on, but let's talk about Brexit. You've sent me a little note here that catches my attention. The House of Lords may make some serious amendments to the Brexit legislation, and Britain is likely to be presented with a $60 billion bill. Now, I saw another story earlier today, and the source of this I do not know, was the economy in the UK is actually improving. Is it improving? And what is happening with this issue of Brexit?
Well, as to the economy, you get mixed signals. Sometimes they say it's improving, but then we also had a report saying that one of the big banks, HSBC, their profits have dropped by 60%, and they blamed it almost entirely on Brexit. Now, as for the House of Lords, I was meeting some members of the House of Lords last night, and they were telling me that they think there's a possibility that they may get through 2 amendments to the Brexit bill. And the 2 amendments are one that says we have to protect the rights of EU citizens here in the UK. And the second one is that Parliament, meaning the House of Commons in this instance, but they would say Parliament, Parliament would have the right to make substantive amendments to any final legislation that might be negotiated with the European community. Now, those are 2 things which the government, Theresa May, has fought against. They're basically trying to keep the issue of EU citizens, trying to keep those citizens as a sort of hostage. At least that's what people call it. They're holding them hostage and saying, basically, we will not agree to give these people any rights until we know we're getting a good deal from the European Commission. And the other issue is they say that Theresa May's government says, yes, Parliament can have a vote, but not on substantive issues. They can only have a vote on whether or not they will accept or reject the final deal. And if they reject it, then we have nothing.
Here's the question before we go to the break with you, Tom. And again, Tom Arms of Viewpoints Around the World, LookAhead Radio, and LookAheadNews.com. There's continuing conflict over the exit of Great Britain from the European Union. There's a point, it strikes me, and I'm just wondering if you're hearing any news from the EU members that they're getting a little frustrated by the absence of clarity coming from the UK.
Oh, yes. Yes, they are, very much so. They want to, because it affects what they do.
Right.
And one of the things also is that they have told Britain that they want $60 billion from them for leaving the EU. Now, you may think, whoa, that's a lot of money. It's money which the European Union says Britain committed itself to over the next 4 years to pay for European-wide projects. And that money will be lost with British withdrawal. And so they're saying, well, we're already committed to these things, and we're committed to the development of these things on the basis that you would be paying into it.
It's going to take many years for the dissembling or the unraveling of the EU relationship and Great Britain. So in that period of time, will not Great Britain continue to be supportive of the EU?
We don't know.
Oh, wow.
Well, that is an unknown. We simply don't know.
All right, we're going to get back to this and more here in just a moment with Tom Arms of Look Ahead Radio and LookAheadNews.com, which, by the way, is free. Sign up for his blog. You get the opportunity to find out about tomorrow's news today on LookAheadNews.com.
Look Ahead Radio will return in just a moment.
This is Tom Arms with LookAheadNews.com's expanded world analysis for the week beginning the 27th of February. Look Ahead broadcasts tomorrow's news today so that you can plan to participate. President Donald Trump gives his first address to a joint session of Congress on Tuesday. House Speaker Paul Ryan said it was the president's opportunity to present his vision about our shared agenda. Down the corridor on the same day, the Senate Foreign Relations Committee discusses U.S. policy towards Iraq post-Mosul. And Defense Secretary James Mattis is expected to present his preliminary plan for the defeat of the jihadists. The order was signed by President Donald Trump on January the 28th, giving Mattis 30 days to draft the plan. Terrorism will also be discussed when EU and American senior officials from justice ministries meet in Malta on Wednesday and Thursday. And again when the German Foreign Minister Sigmar Gabriel meets NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg at NATO headquarters on Wednesday. Other items for discussion at the Stoltenberg-Gabriel meeting are greater European defense cooperation, increased defense spending, and America's apparent drift towards isolationism. American isolationism is the main theme in a report launched in New Delhi on Monday by the Asia Foundation. Entitled Asian Views on America's Role in Asia, it calls on the Trump administration to support the global economic order and maintain its defense commitments. Elsewhere in Asia, Myanmar holds a peace conference next week, aimed at bringing together all the country's feuding ethnic minorities. About 700 delegates representing more than 135 different ethnic groups will attend. In the Middle East, Iran and Russia on Thursday are expected to sign a deal whereby Iran supplies its new ally Russia with 100,000 barrels of oil a day. The oil will be paid for half in cash and the rest in barter. Also next week, Russia's Defense and Security Committee visit Tehran to discuss Syria and Russian arms sales. Iranian President Hassan Rouhani is expected to visit Moscow later in the month. There will be several royal visits next week, but the biggest will be that of Saudi Arabia's King Salman to Indonesia from Tuesday for 8 days. It is the first Saudi royal visit in 50 years to the world's largest Muslim country, and the king is taking an entourage of 1,500 people. Hosting that number will be a major expense for President Joko Widodo, but then he's hoping to sign deals worth $25 billion. In Britain, the Brexit bill goes into the committee stage in the House of Lords on Monday, and same-sex marriage is legalized in Finland on Wednesday, the same day that South Korea introduces state-approved history textbooks, which have been attacked as propaganda by academics. And that was next week's News Today, so that you can plan to participate in the world around you. Stay tuned for Viewpoints Around the World with myself and Lockwood Phillips.
Welcome back to Look Ahead Radio. Here is Lockwood Phillips.
Viewpoints Around the World with Tom Arms of Look Ahead News and Look Ahead Radio, and again, lookaheadnews.com. Tom, we've got a caller standing by. I want to move on to several other items here. I want to get through the British National Health System, and as a matter of fact, in just a moment. First, Walter in Alliance joins us. Walter, yes, sir.
Well, that's a question that I had. If the EU is looking for money for their projects, what I hear on LBC radio is that the national health system is crumbling and the trains aren't running on time. So what did the EU ever do for Britain regarding these programs?
Neither the National Health Service nor the train system were a responsibility of the EU, other than that they gave money for regional development, regional grants, things like that, but not specifically for specific projects. It's always up to the national government. The EU gives money, and then the national government decides how to allocate it. That's the way it works. As for the National Health Service, it is definitely in a crisis. If we're segueing into that,
yes,
it's been losing money for the last few years. The debts are mounting almost as we speak. It's I think like $3 or $4 billion in debt.
Why is that?
It's because of people like me and you, baby boomers. The bump in the population is getting old and sick, and they need a lot more care. And the government is not coughing up the money. They're paying basically the same amount, but more people are needing more care. Wow. It's not the immigrants. I stress it's not the immigrants, because most of the immigrants, especially from EU countries, are young and healthy. It's the indigenous Brits who are sick and old and decrepit like me.
What is the future? What can be done about it?
Well, it's not very good. Nobody knows. But what they're going to have to raise taxes, and this government, being a conservative government, is very opposed to raising taxes to pay for the National Health Service. But the National Health Service is a sacred cow with bells and whistles on. Mm-hmm. They love their NHS.
Well, it's been a topic of discussion here because with the Affordable Care Act, or Obamacare, a lot of folks have focused on the success of the UK's National Health Service. This may pose a problem for those who have been relying on that as a template.
I can see that. In the long term, you and I are going to die. The bump in the population is going to slim down. They're probably going to have too much money. But But, for the next, I'd say foreseeable future, 10 or 15 years at least, they're going to have a real difficulty because the baby boomers just need so much help.
We've got another caller. I'm going to get him on very quickly because I moved on to a few other items. Ernie in Emerald Isle. Ernie, good evening. Yes, sir.
Yeah. Tom, is it true, because this is what we hear in the United States, that if you're 55, you're not eligible for a kidney transplant, a heart transplant, or whatever transplant, that they figure when you're 55 years old, you've had a life, and you're either on the bottom of the list or not on the list at all. Is there truth to that?
No.
Okay. Thank you very much, Ernie. Very good question, because it was wondering if the services were being, in some fashion, identified as to the source of this. Thank you very much, Ernie. Great question. All right, let's move on to a few other items. This is another topic that has received a lot of discussion here in the States here recently. Sweden, and of course the announcement from Donald Trump related to terrorism. He was pilloried by the press that Sweden has no problems with terrorism and with its its immigrants, not just migrants, it's immigrants. I have a personal story to tell you about that in a moment, but how is that being played again in the UK and in Europe? What is the understanding and perception of what's happened in Sweden?
Let's deal first with Trump's speech. They're absolutely flummoxed by it. They can't understand. I mean, it's been reported here that his speech was based on an item on Fox News.
Right.
Now, he's a president of the United States. He has thousands of diplomats.
Mm-hmm.
He has thousands of intelligence agents. And instead of using them to make major statements, he uses Fox News. Now, I'm sure Fox News is a wonderful organization. They provide your news.
Right.
But they're not as good as the entire State Department and the entire CIA and the National Security Council and National Security Agency. The President of the United States should not be making policy statements based on information gathered from watching a television program. As Sweden itself, they took in 250,000 immigrants, or I think even more than that. Their crime rate has been dropping year on year, every year since 2005. Their growth rate is 2.8%, which is a full percentage point higher than either the UK or the US. Or the UK or US or Germany. They are one of the healthier economies in Europe. They have one of the lowest unemployment rates. There are 100 murders a year in Sweden. There are more than 100 murders in 2 days in the United States. They really, he didn't do well.
Okay, but it's interesting. Well, it is interesting. I just have to tell a personal item here on this one. Tom Arms with us with LookAhead News and LookAhead Radio. We're talking about viewpoints around the world. We have exchange students coming to our area on a pretty regular basis, and I had the distinct pleasure of interviewing two of the students who were attending their senior year in the local high school, one from Norway, the other from Sweden. And the young lady from Sweden mentioned the situation related to the immigrants and was very, very explicit in her distaste and dissatisfaction. And she said that the immigrants were ruining her country. And this, she said, notably, 3 years ago. And I thought it was interesting. And at that point, we had no idea of the circumstances there in Sweden. And, of course, then we heard about the police riots just recently. I know I've got a caller
saying... There weren't any.
Excuse me. There were not?
I mean, are we talking about the Trump statement?
No, we're talking about the evening following the Trump statement that apparently there was a riot in Stockholm.
Yes. There was a riot because of the Trump statement.
Well,
I mean, he basically, he sparked off.
Whoa.
He sparked off the problem.
Wait a second. We were told here in the States that it came as a result of a drug raid. Was there no drug raid?
No, I don't know where you're getting this from.
Tom.
We were told here that the people basically got so angry about what Trump said that they rioted.
Tom, it's interesting. Tom Arms, of course, with Look Ahead News and Look Ahead Radio. We've gotten stories here in this country from a variety of good news sources. Try the New York Times, Washington Post, just as an example, that just struck about that this was a drug raid.
I've heard lots of people say that there's, no-go areas and Sharia law and everything else, which is a load of rubbish, here in the UK. When I was 18 years old and living in Washington, D.C., I had my car towed away. And as you probably know, most car pounds are in not very salubrious parts of town.
Okay.
And this was in the middle of the African-American ghetto in Washington. And I had to walk for 4 miles through that. And on 4 different occasions, I had young black men come out and threaten me with straight-edged razors because I was in their country. That's what I call a no-go area.
Okay. All right.
You don't have that over here. You really don't.
Okay. I've got a caller standing by. I've got to go to him very quickly before we go to the break. Gary in Oriental. Gary, yes, sir.
Hi, Tom.
Gary, please.
Tom, you're blaming Donald Trump, President Donald Trump, for the riot in Sweden over what he said. That is so far from the truth, sir. I mean, and I beg to differ with you.
Okay.
But here's the fact of reality. I have family in Sweden. I am Scandinavian. And there are no-go zones. And the immigration problem has become so bad over there that what's going on right now is fathers are walking their 16, 17, 18-year-old girls to school because of the sexual assaults. This is a fact, Tom, and I don't know where you're getting your news, but to sit back and blame the President of the United States for causing a riot is an absolutely absurd statement. And here's another thing, Tom.
Wait, Gary, hold on. Let me just say to this. He is reporting what he's reading. Now, let's not accuse him of creating this, but go ahead, Gary. I apologize.
Well, but the statement's absolutely absurd.
Okay.
I don't know where you're getting your here's the problem, Tom, and think about it. The people in your country that supported Brexit, okay, have never been heard. The people in our country that have supported Donald Trump have never been heard. We are the silent majority. And what you're hearing is the fake news, which is the BBC, ABC, NBC, CBS, you name it. And they are the majority, and basically they are the people that are trying to control the media, and the silent majority, which are the people that supported Brexit, which are the people that supported Trump, that want a free country, are the ones that are speaking. And you do have no-go zones in your country, because I know this for a fact, because my niece and her husband are leaving London because it's becoming so dangerous.
Okay, we're getting to he said, she said. I appreciate that, Gary. I've got to move on to a few other items, but thank you very much for the call. Gary in Oriental, and we've got Tom Arms with us this evening. And let me just say, on behalf of our co-host, Tom Arms, he is sharing with us what he is reading and seeing in the press and the media there in Europe, in the UK, and around the world. This is important. We need to understand that. Stay with us here. We've got more to come here. Viewpoints around the world.
Look Ahead Radio will return in just a moment. We now return to Look Ahead Radio. Here is Lockwood Phillips.
Viewpoints around the world with Tom Arms of Look Ahead Radio and also Look Ahead News. Tom, I want to get off that issue we were chatting about just a few moments ago and get on to some items that I think are very important and still have some impact here, both here and worldwide. You've got recent visits by Vice President Pence. We have Mattis, who is also General Mattis, who is attended the meetings in NATO, and I'm wondering the reaction there since their arrival related to both the EU, which was addressed by both Vice President Pence and Mattis, but definitely Vice President Pence, and NATO. So what is the opinion? What's been the reaction?
I like to say that everyone was reassured by the nice words that were said by Mattis and Pence. Of course, they did qualify them by saying, you've got to cough up more money.
Right.
But they haven't been reassured because they see a disconnect between what Mattis and Pence are saying and what the president is saying.
Right.
And they're very aware that the buck stops in the Oval Office. And so they're not reassured. I think the biggest response was from the German defense minister, a lady called Ursula von Leyen. Now, everyone was at this conference last week in Munich, the Munich Security Conference, which is a big annual event.
Right.
And what she said, she didn't name Trump by name, and she didn't mention the United States by name. But what she said was that there can be no policy of equidistance between allies on one side and those who on the other question our borders, our values, and the principles of international law. And everyone stood up when she said that. And I mean, it was obvious what it was directed at. And they gave her a standing ovation.
Okay.
And she also said that we cannot in any way consider anything which is targeted on Muslims, that it's against our basic values, and that we cannot consider anything related to torture or anything like that. And again, everyone stood up and gave her a standing ovation.
Okay, I want to move on, but what I'm hearing from you is that there's still a great deal of distress with the presidency here in the United States. The question goes very quickly before I want to move on to other things, particularly Greece. What about the future of NATO? Does that in any way settle things with NATO? Both the Vice President and General Mattis were, I thought, positive about the future of NATO.
Yes, they're positive. Trump isn't. That's the problem.
Let me move on to other items. I want to go to the issue of Russian interference in an election. But before I go to that, Greece, some discussion there about a renewal of the loan with Greece between the European Union. What's the future? What's that hold? Because Greece's economy is...
The loan is a sort of joint loan between the European Union and the IMF. And the IMF was holding back.
Okay.
Because they weren't completely satisfied with the EU's rather rosy picture. But they've agreed to it. And so the next tranche of the bailout is going to go ahead. Okay. And then all right. But it's not that simple. It's what I predicted the other week, and that is that it's in a holding pattern until after the German elections.
Okay.
And then you can expect some really hard talking then.
All right. What's the future of the German elections? We're hearing mixed messages here related to Chancellor Merkel and her future.
Well, I think I don't think she has the threat from Alternative for Deutschland, which everyone else seems to think. Okay. There in America. I think that if she has a threat, it is from the left. Alternative for Deutschland still is stuck on between 12 and 15% of the vote. They have a proportional representation system, which means that they were at 12 to 15% of the seats in the Bundestag, which is well short of being able to form a government.
Okay.
But the Social Democratic Party is doing a bit better.
All right, I want to go to one other quick question and just wrap this up before we go to the next item, and I want to get to the topic of Russia and its election interference there. If Germany and France do have a major change in their leadership, Merkel leaves, and in the case of Le Pen in France, should she be elected, what happens, just very quickly, to the European Union?
It's in deep trouble.
Okay, I think that's sufficient for the answer. Let's go to the other topic. Russian interference with an election. Tell us about that.
Well, this was a report in the Daily Telegraph, which they say was a result of discussions with American and British intelligence, and that the Russians actually planned to assassinate on Election Day back in October the Prime Minister of Montenegro. And the reason was because he is planning to take Montenegro into NATO. And that is a red line for the Russians. They have said that, if Montenegro goes into NATO, they will regard it as an unfriendly act. And so in order to prevent it, they actually, according to the intelligence agents, or according to this newspaper, plan to assassinate the prime minister.
Wow. All right.
And it was basically stopped at the last minute. Apparently it was discussed between the British Foreign Secretary Boris Johnson and Rex Tillerson when they met last week.
Now, I'm curious, why were they talking about it?
Well, I think within the context of, you can't trust the Russians.
Okay. All right, we're going to take a quick break on this one. You're listening, of course, to Viewpoints Around the World with Tom Arms. Tom, we're going to get back to several items here. The one I do want to talk to you about is transparency in the international report about ISIS, the Islamic State, and if we can, Ted Malloch. That's an interesting story, one that we really don't cover around here. And then wrapping it up with you about toilets manufactured in China. Trump toilets at that. Stay with us here on Viewpoints Around the World.
Look Ahead Radio will return in just a moment.
Observations of an Expat by Tom Arms from LookAheadNews.com. The Western Alliance is in disarray. Americans are sick of picking up the tab for protecting a rich Europe from a communist threat which no longer exists. Europe is terrified of being abruptly left in the lurch facing a corrupt, authoritarian Russian threat which has replaced the communist one. In the meantime, Britain, the traditional number 2 in the Western Alliance, voted Brexit and pulled the rug out from under the EU, the political and economic arm of the alliance's European end. It is time for a refresher course in the Western or Transatlantic Alliance. It is time for a re-examination of the purpose of the alliance. So here goes. Alliance 101. Franklin Roosevelt had a vision of a post-war world through a United Nations headed by World War II allies America, Britain, China, and Russia. France was a reluctant afterthought. Each of the great powers was given a permanent seat in the newly formed UN Security Council. With the seat came implied responsibility for a slice of the world. America was the Western Hemisphere, Britain, with French help, Western Europe, Africa, and the Middle East, Russia, Eastern Europe, and Central Asia, and China, the Far East. Unfortunately, the dream was nothing more than that. A Britain prostrate from 2 world wars still had to organize a peaceful retreat from empire. The French were in a mess. The Chinese were in a bigger mess and faced a civil war. Only the Russians and Americans emerged better off. Wartime Britain pawned everything but the crown jewels to the US. America was amazingly generous with its repayment scheme, but still ended the war with half the world's GDP and the only nuclear arsenal. The war cost Russia 20 million lives, but it was in control of Eastern Europe and a huge army poised to roll into the defenseless Western Europe. Britain did its best to hold back the ideologically driven Kremlin. It intervened in the Greek Civil War and stopped Russian incursions into Turkey and Iran. But it needed help and turned to the wealthiest country in the world. America responded first with the Marshall Plan and then agreed to join in the creation of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. 4 months later, in September 1949, the Soviets tested their first atomic bomb. They were quickly followed by the British in 1952 and the French in 1960. But as far as nuclear weapons were concerned, it quickly became apparent that the only member of the Western Alliance that could compete with the Russian-controlled Soviet Union was the United States. And that applied to conventional forces as well. So, why did Washington abandon 150 years of isolationism to march to Europe's rescue? There's the kith and kin argument. Most Americans came from somewhere in Europe, and there's much talk about cultural, social, historical, and philosophical links. There has also been, until recently, a perceived common liberal global goal of encouraging representative democracy, international cooperation through multinational organizations, free trade, and the rule of law. Of course, there are other reasons. America needs European markets for its goods, worth $270.3 billion in 2016. And last, but certainly not least, it has been painfully proven that wars in Europe quickly escalate to a global dimension which cost American money and lives. So, since 1947, America has extended a conventional and nuclear umbrella to Europe, encouraged European unity, and worked with Europe at the United Nations and its agencies. At the same time, both sides of the Atlantic have coordinated their policies to ensure the biggest possible positive impact in every corner of the globe. Overall, the result has been good. The Soviet Union collapsed, and the world as a whole has seen the longest period of peace and prosperity since modern man emerged 35,000 years ago, especially in Europe. things are so good that people have dared to forget history and dream of a post-conflict Europe. Such dreams are more dangerous than the old Soviet threat.
Welcome back to Look Ahead Radio. Here is Lockwood Phillips.
Viewpoints around the world with Tom Arms this afternoon with us. And Tom, we've got several items to talk about here, and we'll kind of hit them quickly, but I think they're important ones. One that strikes me as interesting, Transparency International report says that the Islamic State will not be defeated until corruption is defeated. That's an interesting conclusion.
Yeah.
Share that with us, if you will.
I think it can be applied to a lot of other areas of the world, too.
Yes.
What they're saying is that the corruption in the established government, which is backed up by Britain and America and other countries, that corruption is turning people away from the established government to ISIS. ISIS is exploiting it to gain support.
Okay, real quickly, which governments are we talking about? Iraq? Syria? What?
No, we're talking about the Iraqi government in this case.
Okay.
But they also specifically mention Egypt as well, and Saudi Arabia and Nigeria.
I'm going to say something that is, well, potentially uncomfortable. These are governments that are indicative of the cultures in which they were developed. They are not your standard Western culture, nor are they your standard, as a result, standard Western type of government. There is the concept of graft. Has been the case for thousands of years. These are countries now. Iraq, of course, is a manufactured company, but Iran, Syria, Egypt, these are countries that have always had this kind of, well, cultural relationship with government. I'm intrigued that that is seen as the cause for the, and that's how I'm taking this, for the development and the sustainability of the Islamic State.
Well, what I'm saying is that, yes, there's a big boulder of truth in what you say. I agree. But at the same time, a lot of people who are opposing the government are claiming that one of the reasons for their opposition is corruption. And if you're opposed to the government, you look around for an alternative. And if the alternative happens to be Islamic jihadist group, and it's the only alternative available, then you go to that.
Well,
I'm giving the Transparency International argument.
It's a weak argument, I have to say, just as an observer of it. All right, let's move on to other items. Ted Malloch, very quickly, because we've got to get to the Trump toilets. Who is Ted Malloch, and what's the story here?
Ted Malloch is an academic working in the UK.
Okay.
Who is swanning around Europe claiming that he is the Trump designate as the ambassador to the European Union, and that he is going to, but he also worked, he claims that he worked in helping to organize the downfall of the Soviet Union, which is a bit dicey.
Okay.
And that his next job is going to be to organize, at the behest of Donald Trump, the downfall and collapse of the European Union, and that he's been told this is going to be his job, and that's what he's setting out to do.
Is this a paid job?
The European Parliament has basically passed a resolution saying that, if Trump dares to appoint him as ambassador, he would almost immediately be called persona non grata, and they regard it as a very unfriendly act.
Okay. Then next question, let's wrap it up since we're talking about Trump. Toilets manufactured in China?
Yeah, called Trump toilets. And they've been manufactured, had nothing to do with his name. It just happened to be that's what they called their toilets when they started manufacturing them back in 2002. And there's 100 million of them now in China. But the lawyer for the Trump organization has complained that someone was improperly squatting on his company's rights.
And his name.
And he wants them to change the name.
I think that's humorous. I love it. Well,
it could be another big Sino-American diplomatic clash there.
Or an opportunity.
The relations between the two countries are going down the toilet.
But at the same time, it may be an opportunity to flush out even more money from China. I thought I'd leave it at that one. Tom, as always, looking forward to next week. What's on tap?
Oh, who knows? Anything could happen in the next 7 days, Lockwood. I mean,
but no big.
It's happening so fast. It's almost impossible to predict.
I can imagine that. Tom Arms of Look Ahead News and Look Ahead Radio. And, of course, Look Ahead Radio heard every Friday afternoon here on the talk station. LookAheadNews.com, a free blog. You want to find out about tomorrow's news? Today, simply log on to LookAheadNews.com. You're listening to Viewpoints Around the World with Tom Arms.
Look Ahead Radio is a production of the talk station.